Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I love sewing with my little Featherweight sewing machine. However, I don't sew with it enough because, well, I keep it in its little travel case. So I've decided to take it out of its travel case and put it in a home. And I did find a vintage treadle table. Now the sewing machine is no longer there, but I'm going to be able to use the table. Now that the machine is out in the open, I do need a cover for the machine. Now I did find a pattern from the Featherweight shop, and it is this cute little sewing machine, and this is done with paper piecing. Normally when we do paper piecing, we stitch on top of the paper and then we take that paper off. But this time I'm going to be stitching it on top of a medium weight fusible interfacing, and I'm going to leave it on. And that's going to give it a little bit of body so that I can make that cover out of it. This pattern is from Charise Creates, and it is a foundation paper piece. And it comes in two different sizes, a 10-inch and a 12-inch. The 10-inch is on one page, and the 12-inch comes with 3 different pages. The pattern's the same, it's just a different size. So we're going to photocopy this, and then we're going to cut it apart in sections, sew it with the seam allowance. And we normally do this with paper, but I am going to be using a fusible interfacing. So I've taken this pattern and I printed it onto a printable fusible interfacing. Now this, I would say, would be a medium or a light. So it is an interfacing with an adhesive on the one side. So I've printed this out, and when I did print it out, I did take the numbers that would be in that white background fabric and I whited them out, and then I copied it. I don't want the shadows showing through on my white fabric. Once I have that printed on that sheet, I'm going to be able to cut this apart in sections. So here's an example of how those sections are going to be like. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew each of these sections, create those little units, and then sew all of the units together. So I'm going to print it, cut it out, and get it all ready to go. So once that interfacing has been all cut apart, this is what it is going to look like. I'm going to leave the original pattern with the markings right beside, and that way I can refer to it as I'm stitching. So when we look at the directions, she builds that spool, she builds all of these units, and then she starts putting it together. Now these pieces are without a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once I'm finished stitching each piece, I'm going to have to add them. So I'm going to start with this bottom one. So to make this little piece, I am going to need a little blue and a little background fabric. The printed work is going to be the back. So we're going to take our fabric and turn it so it's upside down. And this is going on top. I'm going to need a 1/4 inch all the way around this piece. And I'm going to be stitching on this white piece. For this, I could really just sew 2 pieces of fabric together and then fuse that on. And that might be the easiest for this tiny little piece because there is only that one seam. Having this stitched together means I can press those seams in either direction, or I can also press them open. But what I want to do is I want to fuse that right along that area. So the seam is going along the seam. Having that interfacing fusible definitely makes this easy, but I will need to now trim a 1/4 inch all the way around. So any ruler will work fine, and trim that down. So that first piece is done. This is going to be the back. This is going to be the right side. And I am going to put that right back in place and take the next one. So for this piece, because there is a particular angle, I will be paper piecing this. So I'm going to iron this piece on, but I'm not ironing that corner. I need to give myself a 1/4 inch seam allowance underneath this line. And a piece of cardboard is going to be very helpful. Place your cardboard down right along that line, fold it. Now trim off a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once that is trimmed off, you can see where we now have that 1/4 inch. So I'm going to be able to line up my fabric. So I want the right sides of that fabric touching, and I do want a piece big enough that when I flip it over, it is going to cover. So I can just pin that fabric on and go to the machine and stitch right along that line. So I just had enough to trim off. This piece is now done. I'm going to put it back in place and take the next piece. This one, I have the 2 corners on. So I'm going to make sure that I have a piece big enough. And then carefully, I'm going to just press just a little bit to hold that piece on. Now I need to put my ends. I'm going to do this the same way. This line is a stitching line, so I'm going to put this down, fold that over, and trim a 1/4 inch. And trim this next side. Just fold along that stitching line and trim. Place this piece of fabric so the right sides are touching. Pin, and I'm going to do this at the same time. Right sides touching, pin, and then I'm going to stitch, press those back, iron them together, and then trim. One more piece is now done. So for even these really small pieces, I'm going to do it the same way. I'm going to put that cardboard on the stitching line, fold it back, and trim that 1/4 inch. I'm going to place right sides together and stitch right along that line. Now once I've stitched that seam, before I press, I'm going to trim that down to even 1/8 of an inch. I'm just going to give it a tiny little seam allowance. Now press that over and trim a 1/4 inch all the way around. So now I'm going to be able to match those together, and I'm going to put a pin in this corner coming out of that corner, and that's going to help line me up. Stitch that 1/4 inch seam, and this is how we sew all of those little pieces together. So I'm going to continue and stitch all of these pieces, and then I'm going to be able to go through and sew those all together. Once everything's been trimmed off and it looks nice, I get to see the big reveal. But what I want to do now is frame this and turn it into a machine cover. So I want this little piece in front of my sewing machine. So I'm going to start and add a border onto the bottom and the 2 sides. And I'm going to add 2.5 inches. And I'm going to be able to adjust that size after. That 2.5 inches does give a good fit. It's going to cover the machine plus a little extra. I need to measure the rest of the distance, which is about 18 inches. So I have that front and a lot of extra on the back, but I do want a flat top. And I want it about 7 inches because my bed is 7 inches. So I have a 6-inch ruler, and that'll give you an idea on why we need a little bit extra. So after all of my trimming down, my piece is 11.5 inches by 27 inches long. Now that this piece has been decided, I do want to decide on some arms. So I do have a 7-inch measurement. So I'm going to do 7.5 inches because I will need a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to have that 7.5 inches come out both of these sides. I'm going to cut my fabric 7.5 inches by 10.5 inches, and I need 2 pieces. So I just want to center that and stitch a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to have these 2 arms off of both sides. Now, of course, yours can be different depending on the size that you want. From here, we need to do something with this to sort of make it into a hard cover. or what I would call a soft hard cover. Now you can take this and sandwich it and turn it into a quilt. But I am going to use some foam. And I want the foam to cover the entire piece. My foam is pressed on. Now we need to make a decision. Are we going to want a lining? If we want a lining, we need to duplicate this size in another piece of fabric. If you have made this as a quilt, you probably have a good side already on that back, so you won't have to worry about it. So for myself, I'm going to press another piece of fabric right on top of this. This is two-sided, so it's going to adhere on this side as well. So I have my front fabric, the foam in between, and a background fabric. Now this foam, of course, you can quilt, but I want it very smooth looking, so I will not be quilting it. I'm just going to stitch the arms together. These two seams are going to go together, these two, and these two. So you're going to take that and just fold it. Stitch down there, take the next two, put them together. So you will be making a box. So this is what we have when we have those four corners sewn together. Now if you wanted a pocket, you could have added some pockets here before you sewed those sides together. I have a drawer, so I would not be using these pockets. I will finish these edges off with some binding. To put that binding on, both ends can be raw. This top part, we're going to be able to finish that off when we roll this over and stitch it. We're just going to fold that inside, give it a little tuck, and then stitch it down. Once we're finished that inside binding, just trim off everything so that bottom is nice and flat. And now put binding on the bottom. With that binding stitched, the cover is done. And it's going to fit right over the machine. It's a nice snug fit so the dust doesn't go in, and it has that beautiful boxy look. So I've used the paper piecing method with a fusible interfacing, and I've turned that into a sewing machine cover. Be sure to customize the size to your machine and customize your little sewing machine. The sewing machine cover turned out really sweet. I love the way all of those little pieces went together precisely with that paper piecing. And using that fusible interfacing means we didn't have to take out the paper, and it did help keep it nice and stiff. So now my Featherweight has a cover. What's not to love about this? I'll put a link in the description so you can check out that pattern and perhaps make a cover for your little Featherweight. And thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and I have a newsletter. It's all free under Sew Very Easy. And be sure to make every day a Sewtacular day. Bye for now.